Hi, my name is Ante Jarancic and welcome to Artists with Andy Bites. As mentioned in one of my earlier videos, these Bites recordings are recordings on the go, on the run, of things that come to my mind and that I want to share with you without much sort of production effort and production time invested into these recordings. And I wanted to share with you specifically something about values, right? Whenever you pick up literature, any book on productivity, on leadership, kind of self-help literature and all of that, you will always see that people talk about the importance of personal values. You know, you have to be clear on what it is that you're pursuing. You have to be clear what is important for you in life. And they always come back to the same thing. I remember actually reading many years ago, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where Stephen Covey uses this illustration, and some of you might notice, right? You know, think about that your life is this glass jar, you know, and then, you know, obviously what you have to put in are these big rocks or stones, let me put it this way, in there, and then you put in pebble, and then after that you put sand, and then later on at the end you put in water, right? So you have to begin with the first things first, because if you begin with things that are not that important, if you begin with sand and fill it up with sand, you won't be able to add in those pebbles and the rocks anymore. So this idea that you have to be clear about the most important things in life. And I have to say, for many years, as I would encounter similar versions of this idea, I was kind of dismissing it as really not that important and a little bit corny, I have to admit. It didn't really work for me. Then something changed. And I will tell you about the change at some other point. But I think I found a way in which these values are really effective if they become associated and connected to some specific strategies, not just goal setting, but other strategies. But that, putting that aside, there's one thing that I wanted to specifically kind of communicate a little bit, and that is when I look at my list of values, and I have kind of two basic categories, let me put it this way. One category is this more like vision of life and things that I consider important and things that I want to learn and things that I want to sort of be part of and all of that. And then there's another set of values that I have. I call them identity values. And these are not just a philosophy of life, then more like a philosophy of existence or philosophy of being, the kind of person I aspire to be and would like to be. But again, not simply as a way of aspirations, but actually finding strategies in terms of planning, weekly reviews, daily reviews, habit development of habits and all of that, that leads us towards the acquiring of these individual identity values. And what I plan to do in my future videos is actually to go through each one of them and just share with you, and then you can see if this makes sense to you, or you can then certainly compare it with what you consider to be important. But all that aside, I have kind of a paragraph that introduces these different identity values. And my very first statement, my very first sentence says the following: the central goal of my life, I'm actually reading this off the screen here, the central goal of my life is to live out of my deepest values and beliefs in order to become a saint, a sage, a mystic, and a warrior or peaceable warrior. And I remember writing this down one day, and without much thinking, what I actually have done with this sentence, I have basically provided 4 major archetypes of conversion. Now, I don't want to go now into Carl Jung's understanding of archetypes and the basic archetypes that he develops, the persona, the self, and other things that he talks about. He has these major archetypes in terms of hero, jester, and so on and so forth. And these archetypes have been very helpful sort of in understanding what's going on in many contemporary movies, right? They've been also quite a bit attacked by providing sometimes binary thinking, you know, male, female, black, white, and all of that. So there's some problems with these archetypes, and I don't want to go into the whole theory that Carl Jung develops, But I found them to be, it's quite interesting, right? And I have these 4 major archetypes. The saint, right? The saint for me is a person who really embodies, on the one hand, love or compassion and kindness on the one hand, and on the other hand, integrity, right? So one would be the pursuit of compassion, kindness, love. The other one would be integrity. So personal justice, which is integrity, and then kind of communal justice would be then kind of concerned with social justice and all of that. So this is for me a major archetype. And I see many people, obviously in the Bible, satisfy this category of being a saint. People who, you know, speak the truth and are willing to die for truth, or on the other hand, exhibit compassion and kindness towards others. The second one is the sage. It's the wise person, the person who has insight into life, the person who has a good judgment, who is able to pick what is important and to organize his or her life around those central values. Now, again, the idea of wisdom is a rich concept, a huge concept, and there are actually different definitions of what wisdom entails. And it would be certainly fantastic and wonderful to compare some of these different accounts. But, you know, in the scriptures, especially in the wisdom literature, wisdom has to do with a certain kind of knowledge. It has to do with a certain kind of consciousness, the fear of the Lord, having a sense that, you know, the presence of God is always around us. I mentioned knowledge, knowing, you know, God's commands and God's instructions, actually memorizing some of these proverbs and memorizing some of these ideas that the wise people have articulated and stated. So wisdom has these different dimensions to it, but certainly has to do with meaning, has to do with meaning and purpose. It has to do with obedience and surrender. It has to do with good judgment, right? Manifested in good planning and all of that. So this is another archetype. And we have many wise people. Certainly, you know, Solomon would be the greatest example of that, perhaps, in scriptures. And then the notion of a warrior. And I'm not sure if the warrior is the best term. I don't mean this in any sort of classic hero archetype, one that is willing to use all kinds of means to achieve some sort of purpose, you know, be it violence or not violence and all of that. That's not what I mean. And by peaceable warrior, I mean a person who really has the mindset of an athlete, who has this idea of self-discipline and self-awareness and self-control. And we see that very much in scripture as well. For Apostle Paul, self-control is one of the very important virtues of the Christian life. He, for instance, writes that he is, you know, running his race and he wants to run it faithfully, right? And he is exhorting us to train ourselves. The idea is gymnazo, right, from which we get gymnastics. Train yourself into godliness. We have people who are going into the desert in order to be shaped and formed, separating themselves for a period of time. Elijah, John the Baptist, Jesus, Paul, who spent 3 years in the desert in order to come to terms with his weaknesses and come to terms with his calling. So this idea of a person who has mastery over his or her emotions, mastery over you know, impulses and temptations that he or she is facing, a person who is not dependent so much on the thoughts and opinions of others, a person who perseveres, has resiliency, has grit. And there are many examples of this archetype, as I said, in scripture, and obviously also in movies you see this all the time. And then finally, the mystic. Now the mystic is kind of a term that I'm not necessarily the happiest with, because it has, the word has all kinds of connotations for different people. Now, mysticism sometimes is, for some Christians, is perceived as the greatest danger of the Christian faith. And for others, they have all kinds of different understandings of mysticism. I mean none of that. For me, a mystic is not a person who has some sort of extraordinary experiences, right? For me, a mystic is not someone who enters into specific states of mind. or specific, let me say experiences, but someone who has a God consciousness, someone who lives with the awareness of the presence of God in his or her life. Jürgen Moltmann once noted that a mystic, or someone who is really a person whom I would describe a mystic, is someone who sees God in everything and everything in God. Now, of course, that can be understood in some sort of pantheistic or panentheistic terms, where then God is sort of involved and permeates nature, where the distinction between creation and God evaporates. I mean none of that. I simply mean this idea that the earth is filled with the glory of God. I mean with this the idea that, as C.S. Lewis says, that God is constantly walking in our lives, incognito, and often we don't understand him and don't see him. I mean this in the sense of Psalm 139, who says that God is always around us and hems us in front and behind, and that we can not escape his presence. Wherever we go, he is there. And so becoming a person who is growing in the sense of the presence of God, for me, would be this archetype of a mystic. So understood in this very narrow sense, that is what mystic for me means. I could have used a person who is God conscious. I could use a person who is God aware. And perhaps I should use that term. It doesn't really matter. So for me, for instance, Enoch, who walked with God and then he's taken up one day and it just disappears, right? It's a person who walked in the presence of God. Paul, who tells us that we should always, praying without ceasing, meaning having a God consciousness that is with us not only at specific religious times, but having a sense of the presence of God in everything that we do. And of course, throughout history, we have people who have exhibited this, like Brother Lawrence and Frank Laubach and Thomas Kelly and other people like that who have written about this and their experiences and how they have grown in this sense of having a presence of God. Because as I've said many times before, and as I will say, I'm sure in the future, that for me, spiritual growth in many ways, what it represents having the ability to live in the presence of God, or developing an increased awareness of the presence of God in our lives. So these are the four archetypes, right? It is the saint, the sage, the warrior, and the mystic, understood in a specific spiritual sense. Now, if I only had the statement here, right? If I had only that sentence without fleshing it out, it would not make much sense. But all of my 10 basic identity values are reflections of one or two of these archetypes. As a matter of fact, and I have to be quite honest, I actually have a name for each one of these archetypes. And sometimes I visualize myself, and sometimes not myself. I visualize who I would be, or what would this specific archetype that I have named, how would this person exist, and how would this person act, how would this person think in that particular circumstance. Now, in closing, I would like to connect these archetypes with another idea. A while ago, I read a book by Todd Herman, The Alter Ego, The Power of Secret Identities to Transform Your Life. And Todd Herman is a performance coach, and he has coached many successful and very, professional athletes. And I really like this notion of alter ego that he develops. This idea that, that how he helps people to think about their identity and who is this identity, some alternative identity they want to plug in as they're about to engage in some sort of, game or some sort of competitive situation. And as I was reading this, I realized, well, wait a minute. In some way, these four archetypes that I have, they are types of my alter ego. These archetypes represent Ante as he would be if he would really live out the essential identity values that I subscribe to. And for me, again, this is not something that is only on a piece of paper or in a file, something that I just look at from time to time. No, 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 no. I really try to develop ways, set aside time when I think through these things and go through life situations and ask myself, well, what would have David Brunner done in that situation? David Brunner is the name of one of my alter egos / spiritual archetypes or identity values archetypes that I have. And I find this to be incredibly important. First of all, it enables me to develop a greater degree of self-knowledge. Secondly, it enables me to visualize future situations. So when they come, I can be more alert to what is going on around me. And perhaps, as Viktor Frankl taught us to do, to kind of create a little bit more space between stimulus and response, between this situation that is emerging and then reacting out of a place which is purely emotional and purely affective and doesn't come from our values. So guys, this is what I wanted to share. And this is really incredibly important to me. It has changed my life. It has helped me to live in a different way. And how and why I'm using this, more about this in the future. So thank you so much. I wanted to share this. This just came to my mind. And again, live well, stay courageous, and until soon.